He held the alien princess as she died, and her family gasped when his touch made her shiver, and he trosed above Earth's orbital station like a geometric jewel, all sharp angles and crystalline surfaces that reflected the distant sun into 1,000 fractured rainbows. Commander James Reeves straightened his dress uniform as he walked through the entrance, his boots echoing against floors of polished metal that seemed to absorb sound itself. This was the most important moment of his career, perhaps the most important moment in human history. Today, humanity would finally establish formal relations with the Valorian Empire, a civilization that had existed for over 10,000 years. The Valorians themselves moved through the hall with mechanical precision. They were tall and elegant, their skin a pale blue that seemed to shimmer under the station lights. Their features were sharp and angular, perfectly symmetrical in a way that made James think of computer-generated faces. They communicated through a combination of formal hand gestures and a language that sounded like crystalline chimes, beautiful but cold. Emperor Kess sat at the head of the great negotiation table, his presence commanding the room despite his statue-like stillness. Next to him stood his daughter, Princess Arya. James found himself studying her with more interest than was perhaps professional. She was younger than he expected, perhaps no more than 30 years old in human terms. Unlike the other Valorians who seemed almost robotic in their movements, there was something different about Arya. Her eyes moved with more curiosity, tracking details around the room, rather than staring ahead in the rigid fashion of her people. The Valorian delegation presented their terms with mathematical precision. Trade agreements calculated to decimal points, territorial boundaries marked with astronomical accuracy. James and his team responded in kind, though human negotiation always felt more like dialogue than calculation to him. There was room for discussion, for finding common ground, for understanding. That was when Arya collapsed. One moment she was standing beside her father's chair. The next, she simply dropped to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. The movement was so sudden and unexpected that several diplomats gasped. James was on his feet immediately, his instinct to help overriding protocol. "Don't move," a Valorian medical officer commanded, raising a device that looked like a combination of a flashlight and a scanner. The other Valorians formed a protective barrier around their princess, their faces. What could be read of them? Showing something that might have been alarm. The Valorian doctors worked quickly and efficiently. They scanned her with instruments that hummed with barely contained energy. They administered something through her skin that caused a faint luminescence to spread through her veins. But nothing worked. As minutes stretched into hours, Arya's condition deteriorated visibly. Her skin, which had been that pale, shimmering blue, began to fade to a grayish tone. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. Emperor Kess remained standing throughout, his expression unchanging. But James noticed the subtle tightening around his eyes. The tension in the room grew thick as concrete. "We are unable to determine the source of the malfunction," one of the medical officers announced formally. "Her biological systems are experiencing synchronized failure. All neural indicators suggest a cascade collapse of vital functions." "How long?" The Emperor's voice was quiet, but carried absolute authority. "Hours. Perhaps less." James watched as Arya was carefully moved to a medical station that the Valorians had hastily set up in a side chamber. Through the transparent walls, he could see her lying motionless, surrounded by humming devices and glowing readouts that he couldn't begin to understand. The Valorian medical team worked with frantic precision, but their eyes held something James recognized: helplessness. He approached Emperor Kess carefully, aware that he was walking a dangerous line between compassion and disrespect. "Your Majesty, I'm deeply sorry. If there is anything the human contingent can do to help, you cannot help," the Emperor replied, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. But James found himself drawn back to the observation window anyway. He looked at Princess Arya, so young, so alive just moments before, lying in that sterile chamber surrounded by incomprehensible technology. The Valorian doctors moved around her like ghosts, checking readings and making adjustments that seemed increasingly desperate. As the hours passed and Arya's condition continued to worsen, something in James rebelled against the passive coldness of the moment. The Valorians stood around her like monuments, monitoring her decline with what seemed like clinical detachment. No one held her hand. No one spoke to her. She lay there, slowly fading, surrounded by the people closest to her, yet utterly alone. The Emperor had turned away completely, returning to his station at the negotiation table, as though his daughter were not in the process of ceasing to exist in the next room. James found himself making a decision that would change everything. He walked into the medical chamber, ignoring the protests of the Valorian doctors. He looked at Princess Arya's face, peaceful but fading, and he sat down beside her. Gently, carefully, he reached out and took her hand. Her skin was cold and growing colder. "I'm here," he said simply in English, knowing she wouldn't understand the words but hoping she might understand the meaning. "You're not alone." He didn't notice at first that the Valorian medical instruments had begun to register a change. He didn't notice the sudden silence that fell over the room, or the fact that every member of the Valorian delegation had turned to stare at him. He only noticed because her hand moved slightly in his, and her eyes opened just a fraction of a millimeter. And then her entire body shivered. The moment Princess Arya's hand moved in his grip, Commander James Reeves felt a surge of relief wash through him. It was small, barely a flutter of movement, but it was something. It meant she was still there, still fighting, still present in her body, even as her life seemed to be slipping away like sand through an hourglass. The Valorian medical officers rushed forward, their chime-like voices rising in urgent queries to one another. Their instruments began to beep and hum with new intensity, displaying readings that made the doctors pause and recalibrate their devices. But James barely noticed the commotion. His attention remained fixed on the young princess before him. "It's okay," he said softly, continuing to speak, even though he knew she couldn't understand his words. Human language and Valorian communication were completely different systems. Yet he found himself believing that understanding went deeper than mere words. "I'm right here. You're going to be all right." Arya's eyes flickered again, moving slightly beneath her eyelids. Her breathing, which had become almost imperceptible just minutes before, seemed to stabilize just a fraction. James made a decision that went against every protocol he had learned in his diplomatic training. He leaned closer to her and began to talk, really talk, not in the formal, calculated manner of diplomacy, but with genuine feeling. "I come from a world called Earth," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It's smaller than your empire, I know, and not nearly as advanced. But it's beautiful, in ways I'm not sure your instruments could ever measure. We have oceans that move with the tides, and forests where sunlight filters through a million leaves. We have music and laughter, and stories that we tell around fires at night." As he spoke, he became aware that the Valorian medical team had stepped back. They were watching him with an intensity that made the hairs on his neck stand up, but they weren't stopping him. In fact, Emperor Kess himself had appeared in the doorway of the medical chamber, his expression unreadable, but his presence commanding attention. James continued, his voice growing warmer, more personal. "On Earth, when someone you care about is struggling, you don't just stand around with instruments and machines. You sit with them, you hold their hand. You tell them stories and remind them why life is worth fighting for. Because that's what we do as humans. We connect. We feel things deeply, and sometimes those feelings are what save us when nothing else can." There was no way she could understand English, yet something in his tone, in his presence, seemed to be reaching her. Her skin, which had faded to that terrible grayish color, seemed to have a hint more color returning to it. Her breathing continued to deepen, becoming less labored. "My grandmother used to say that every moment of life is a gift," James continued, finding himself speaking from a place deep within his heart. "She said that we don't appreciate how precious living is until we come close to losing it. She lived to be 97 years old, and you know what she told me on her last day? She said she was grateful for every single moment, every conversation, every sunrise she had witnessed." One of the Valorian doctors approached with a device, but the Emperor raised a hand, a gesture that needed no translation, and the doctor retreated. The Emperor watched, his pale blue face perfectly still, but but his eyes tracked every movement, every word, every gesture. Arya's hand tightened slightly in James's grip. It was barely noticeable, but it was real. Her eyes opened a bit wider, and for just a moment, they seemed to focus on his face. "You see," James said with a gentle smile, "you're stronger than this. I don't know what's happening to you, and I don't know why your doctors can't fix it with all their amazing technology. But I know this, you're in there, you're fighting, and that matters more than any machine could ever measure." He kept talking, his voice a steady anchor in the sterile medical chamber. He spoke about Earth's mountains and deserts, about the way humans gathered together to celebrate life, even in the face of hardship. He spoke about how emotions weren't weaknesses but connections, threads that bound people together, that gave life meaning. The medical instruments around them began to register changes. The readings that had been declining started to stabilize. Some actually began to rise. The Valorian doctors looked at each other with expressions of visible confusion, exchanging their crystalline chime sounds in urgent, rapid sequences. "In our culture," James said, continuing his one-sided conversation, "we believe that no one should face their darkest moments alone. We believe that the presence of another person, the knowledge that someone cares, that someone is fighting alongside you, that has power. Real power. The kind of power that goes deeper than any technology." Arya's eyes opened a bit more. Her skin tone continued to improve, the grayish pallor gradually giving way to hints of her natural blue. Her breathing became fuller, deeper, more alive, and then, impossibly, a faint smile touched the corners of her mouth. The Emperor stepped forward, his gaze shifting from his daughter to James and back again. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, something flickered across his face, something that might have been confusion, or wonder, or perhaps the beginning of understanding. The medical instruments continued their beeping, but now the sounds seemed different. Where before they had been the sounds of decline, now they seemed almost hopeful. Sarah Chen pushed her way through the crowd of human diplomats gathered outside the medical chamber, her mind racing with questions that demanded answers. As the chief xenobiologist on the diplomatic mission, she had been reviewing the Valorian medical data in real time, watching the impossible happen on her screens. The princess should be dead. All the biological indicators pointed to complete system failure. Yet, somehow, impossibly, she was recovering. Sarah's sharp eyes studied the data streaming across her portable device. The numbers made no sense. Princess Arya's neural activity, which had been collapsing into dangerous patterns, was now spiking upward. Her cardiovascular function, which had nearly stopped, was now stabilizing. But what caused the change? The Valorian doctors hadn't introduced any new medications. They hadn't performed any surgical interventions. Nothing had changed, except for one thing: the presence of a human male holding the princess's hand. "That's impossible," Sarah muttered to herself, her scientist's mind already forming theories and discarding them just as quickly. She moved closer to the observation window, her eyes narrowing as she watched Commander Reeves continue his quiet conversation with the recovering princess. She had learned enough Valorian medical terminology over the past weeks to recognize the documents scattered across the Valorian medical stations. Sarah carefully reviewed them, cross-referencing with her own knowledge of human biology and the little that was known about Valorian physiology. What she found made her breath catch. The princess's illness wasn't something physical in the traditional sense. It wasn't an infection or a degradation of organs. The medical records showed that her neural pathways had been experiencing a cascade failure, a shutdown of the very systems that controlled her life force. But the cause listed in the medical notes was something the Valorian doctors seemed to struggle to even name. They referred to it in their clinical language as emotional resonance deficiency. Sarah's eyes widened. She looked back at the princess, then at the commander, then back at the data. A wild theory began to form in her mind. She turned and practically ran to find the head of the Valorian medical delegation, Dr. Veln, a tall blue figure with sharp features and an expression of perpetual analytical distance. Sarah approached him with barely contained excitement. "Dr. Veln, I need to ask you something about the princess's condition," Sarah began, speaking carefully in the formal English that the Valorian delegation had learned. The medical records mention emotional resonance deficiency. I need to understand what that means in Valorian biology. Veln's crystalline chime sounds rose and fell as he considered the question. It is a condition that has not been encountered in documented history, he finally replied. Our people have evolved beyond emotional dependency. We operate on pure logic and reason. Emotions are considered inefficiencies in decision-making. Sarah felt a chill run through her. So, you're saying that Valorians don't experience emotions? We have transcended such primitive responses, Dr. Velm confirmed. Emotions cloud judgment and create instability. But what if, Sarah said carefully, choosing her words with precision, what if emotions aren't primitive? What if they're actually essential to your biology in ways you haven't fully understood? What if they're like a nutrient that your bodies need to survive? Dr. Veln's expression didn't change, but his antennae-like sensory organs tilted slightly. A gesture Sarah had learned indicated surprise or recalibration of thought. Sarah continued, her words tumbling out faster now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in her mind. Think about it. The princess was isolated in your environment where emotions are suppressed. She showed curiosity, which is an emotion. She deviated from standard protocol, an emotional response, but your culture doesn't allow for that. So her body began to shut down because it was being starved of something essential. She gestured toward the medical chamber where James continued to sit beside Arya. Commander Reeves is providing emotional connection, real, genuine human warmth and compassion. Your instruments are showing her recovery beginning immediately after that emotional contact began. That's not coincidence. That's biology responding to something it desperately needed. The Valorian doctor was silent for a long moment. Around them, other medical officers had begun to listen, their crystalline chime sounds rising in debate. This would suggest a fundamental flaw in our understanding of our own biology, Veln said slowly. Or a fundamental misunderstanding of what emotions actually are, Sarah countered. Humans have always known that emotional connection is vital. We have hearts that race when we're excited or afraid. We have tears of both joy and sorrow. These aren't inefficiencies. They're the deepest parts of what makes us alive. If your species evolved away from that, you might have lost something essential. Back in the medical chamber, Princess Arya opened her eyes fully for the first time. Her gaze found James's face, and though she still couldn't understand his words, something passed between them. A recognition, a connection that transcended species and biology and the cold calculations of machines. Her vital signs spiked upward on every monitor. Her color continued to improve. Her breathing became strong and steady. Dr. Veln turned to watch the scene unfolding before them, and for the first time in the conversation, Sarah saw something flicker across his face, something that might have been the ghost of emotion itself. It appears, he said slowly, that we have much to learn from humanity about the true nature of survival. In that moment, the entire paradigm of Valorian science tilted on its axis. Everything they thought they understood about their own biology, about the nature of life itself, was being challenged by something as simple and profound as human compassion. 3 weeks had passed since Princess Arya collapsed, and the medical chamber had transformed from a place of despair into something resembling a research facility. The princess was no longer on the verge of death. She was thriving. Her recovery was so complete that the Valorian medical team could barely explain it using their existing models of biology. But one thing was undeniable. She was alive and getting stronger every day. What nobody expected was how much she had changed in every other way as well. Princess Arya sat in the observation lounge of the orbital station, her pale blue skin now radiant with health. But it was her behavior that had caused the greatest shock to the Valorian delegation. She was asking questions, lots of questions, and not the clinical, methodical questions of a Valorian scholar seeking data points. These were questions filled with genuine curiosity, wonder, and something that looked suspiciously like enthusiasm. "Tell me again about laughter," she said to Commander Reeves, who sat across from her with a gentle smile. "In the medical records, I have read that humans produce this response involuntarily when experiencing joy. It seems inefficient, yet you all do it constantly. James chuckled, which of course proved his point perfectly. Laughter isn't about efficiency, Your Highness. It's about connection. When people laugh together, something happens. A bond forms. We feel less alone in the universe. Arya tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that suggested she was trying to memorize not just his words, but the very concept behind them. On Valorian, we have eliminated such behaviors. We deemed them counterproductive to our advancement. And yet, James said gently, here you are, recovering from an illness that your advanced medicine couldn't treat, an illness that came from a lack of those very things you eliminated. In another section of the station, Emperor Kess was having a very different kind of conversation with Dr. Sarah Chen and Dr. Velm. The three of them stood before a holographic display showing Princess Arya's neural patterns over the past 3 weeks. The data is irrefutable, Dr. Knight. Velm was saying, his voice carrying a tone that Sarah had come to recognize as uncertainty, something that should not exist in a purely logical being. The princess's neural pathways are not only healing, they are developing new connections. Complex networks that were previously dormant are becoming active. These patterns correlate directly with emotional processing centers. The Emperor studied the display in silence. His face, always difficult to read, seemed even more closed than usual. But Sarah noticed the subtle tension in his posture, the almost imperceptible tremor in his antennae-like sensory organs. Your Majesty, Sarah ventured carefully, have you considered that perhaps your entire civilization might benefit from understanding emotions rather than suppressing them? The Emperor turned to look at her, and for a moment, Sarah wondered if she had overstepped. Valorian culture was rigid, their hierarchy absolute. A human scientist questioning the foundational beliefs of an ancient empire was perhaps the definition of hubris. But instead of dismissal, the Emperor asked a question. What would you have us do, Dr. Chen? Our people have built our civilization on logic for 10,000 years. Logic has made us advanced. Logic has made us powerful. And yet, he paused, looking back at the holographic display. Logic could not save my daughter. That simple statement seemed to open something in the Emperor. Over the following days, a quiet revolution began to take place within the Valorian delegation. The Emperor requested more information about human emotional psychology. He asked James to describe human relationships, not in clinical terms, but as lived experience. He began to spend time with his daughter, not in the formal manner of Valorian protocol, but in genuine conversation. And Princess Arya, standing at the bridge between two worlds, became the catalyst for profound change. She called for a formal address to the entire Valorian delegation. When she appeared, James was struck by how different she seemed from the rigid, protocol-bound princess he had first met. There was a fluidity to her movement now, a vibrancy to her presence. My people, she began, her voice carrying the weight of authority, but also something new, passion. I have been given a second chance at life. This gift came not from our greatest medicine or our most advanced technology. It came from something we have spent millennia calling primitive and inefficient. It came from compassion. From genuine care, from the simple act of another being choosing to sit with me in my darkness, rather than standing at a clinical distance. We have believed that emotions are weaknesses to be eliminated, but I have learned that emotions are the deepest form of strength. They are what connect us not just to each other, but to the very essence of being alive. The Emperor rose from his seat, and the entire assembly fell silent. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to reshape the very air around them. My daughter speaks with wisdom that transcends our conventional understanding. For 10,000 years, we have believed ourselves superior because we eliminated what we called inefficiency. Perhaps, he paused, and Sarah could have sworn she saw something like emotion flicker across his face. Perhaps we have been measuring superiority by the wrong standards. Commander Reeves, your species demonstrates qualities that we have long dismissed as primitive, yet those qualities saved my daughter when all our science could not. I propose that we establish not merely a trade alliance with humanity, but a cultural exchange. We have much to learn from you about the true meaning of survival and strength." Princess Arya smiled, a gesture that would have been considered highly unusual in Valerian culture just weeks before, but now it seemed natural, even necessary. The foundations of two civilizations had begun to shift. What started as a diplomatic crisis had become something far greater: the beginning of true understanding between species, the recognition that emotions and logic were not opposites, but different languages expressing the same fundamental truth about what it meant to be alive. 6 months had passed since that pivotal moment when Commander James Reeves held Princess Arya's hand and changed the course of two civilizations. The orbital station had transformed into something unprecedented, a true bridge between worlds. Where once there had been careful diplomatic distance, now there was genuine collaboration and shared discovery. Princess Arya stood before the great assembly of both human and Valorian delegates, her appearance a perfect symbol of the change that had taken place. She still wore the formal garments of her station, but they were now adorned with small tokens from Earth: a strand of blue lapis lazuli, a piece of coral that shimmered with impossible colors, gifts that represented human appreciation for beauty and natural wonder. These were things the old Arya would have called decorative inefficiency. The new Arya understood them as expressions of joy. "Today marks the official establishment of the Harmony Accord," she announced, her voice strong and filled with a warmth that would have been unthinkable months before. "This agreement represents not simply a trade partnership or a military alliance. It represents something far more profound: the recognition that different civilizations possess different forms of wisdom, and that our combined knowledge will be greater than the sum of our individual achievements." Unable to suppress a smile, he had watched Arya transform from a young woman literally dying from emotional isolation into a passionate advocate for cultural evolution. More importantly, he had watched her discover something that humans took for granted: the joy of genuine connection. But the real transformation was happening throughout Valorian society itself. The Valorian Council of Scientists had begun what they called the Emotional Integration Initiative. It was a careful, measured process, appropriate for a civilization that had spent 10,000 years refining logic. But the changes were undeniable. Young Valoronians were now permitted to study human literature and music. Meditation centers were being established where Valoronians could explore emotional awareness without the fear of being labeled inefficient. Most remarkably, families were beginning to spend time together not for strategic purposes, but for connection. Dr. Velen approached James during a break in the formal proceedings. The Valorian scientist's expression had developed subtle nuances over the months, the ability to express curiosity, interest, and something that might have been satisfaction. "Commander Reeves," Dr. Vell began, "I have been analyzing the neurological changes in our population since we began integrating emotional awareness. The results are extraordinary. Our creativity has increased by 47%. Our problem-solving capabilities have improved by 32%. And most significantly, our sense of purpose and life satisfaction has become measurable in ways we never thought possible." James nodded, understanding the weight of this admission. For a Valorian to acknowledge that emotions improved function was revolutionary. "Emotions and logic aren't opponents, Dr. Velm. They're partners. Humans have known this forever, but it took your civilization seeing it through fresh eyes to truly understand it. Your species has a saying," Dr. Veld continued. "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We are beginning to understand this not merely as an abstract principle, but as a lived reality." Meanwhile, in a private chamber, Emperor Kess spent time with his daughter in a way that would have been completely foreign to him just months before. He sat beside her, and they simply talked about hopes, about fears, about dreams for the future. There was no agenda, no strategic goal. They were simply father and daughter, reconnecting across a gulf that had nearly cost him everything. "I was wrong," the Emperor said quietly, his ancient eyes reflecting both sadness for what had been lost and hope for what might be found. "For 10,000 years, I believed I was protecting our people by removing the vulnerabilities of emotion. Instead, I was removing our capacity to truly live. Arya took her father's hand, a gesture that would have been considered undignified in Valorian culture, but which now felt like the most natural thing in the world. You are learning, father. That is what matters. That is what courage truly means. On Earth, the news of the Harmony Accord spread through human civilization like sunrise across an ocean. Humanity had not been conquered. Humanity had not been deemed inferior. Instead, humanity had been recognized as possessing something precious, the ability to feel deeply, to connect genuinely, to find meaning in the most human of qualities, compassion. The United Nations established the Institute for Cross-Species Understanding, with both humans and Valorians as co-directors. Scientists from both worlds worked side by side, sharing knowledge. Engineers collaborated on projects that combined human innovation with Valorian precision. Artists began exchanging their work, creating something entirely new. Hybrid art forms that expressed both the logic of mathematics and the chaos of human emotion. James was appointed as the permanent ambassador of human-Valorian relations. It was a position that would have seemed impossible just months before. But as he stood in the observation deck of the orbital station, looking out at both Earth and the Valorian homeworld in the distance, he understood that nothing was truly impossible. Growth required only the willingness to see beyond old beliefs and embrace new understanding. Princess Arya joined him at the window, and they stood in comfortable silence for a moment. The silence between them was different now. Not the silence of diplomacy or protocol, but the silence of two beings who understood each other without words. "Thank you," Arya finally said softly, "for sitting with me when I was dying, for reminding me that I was not alone." "Thank you," James replied, "for being brave enough to change, for showing your entire civilization that emotion is not weakness, but the deepest form of strength." Below them, on both worlds, societies were beginning to reshape themselves. The Valorians were discovering art and music and the joy of celebration. Humans were learning from Valorian precision and their 10,000-year perspective on the universe. It was not a perfect merger. There were still misunderstandings and challenges, but it was genuine. As the sun set over Earth, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, James realized something profound. Humanity's greatest strength had never been technology or military power. It had always been the capacity to feel, to care, to connect across impossible distances and unbridgeable divides. And now, an ancient alien civilization was learning the same truth. The age of isolation was ending. The age of understanding had begun.